The eviction notice was the third one this month, a bright, garish pink against the perpetual grey of the building's lobby. Maya didn't even bother to read it. She simply folded it and tucked it into the pocket of her worn-out coat, adding another layer to the collection of ignored final warnings. The city had deemed the Ravenswood apartments structurally unsound, a danger to its sole remaining occupant and to the public at large. Demolition was scheduled in 30 days. To Maya, the notice wasn't a threat, it was a declaration of war. This building, with its crumbling brick facade and perpetually leaking roof, was not just a structure. It was her sanctuary, the only constant in a life that had been otherwise defined by loss and transience. It was the shell that contained all her memories, both the painful and the few precious ones, and she would not be forced out. The elevator had given up the ghost years ago, so she took the stairs, her footsteps echoing in the cavernous, dusty silence. Each floor was a monument to abandonment. Doors to apartments stood ajar, revealing hollowed-out spaces filled with debris and the ghosts of former lives. The air was thick with the smell of damp plaster, rotting wood, and something else, something older and more mineral, like the breath of the earth itself. On the fourth-floor landing, a section of the banister was missing, having finally splintered and fallen into the stairwell below last winter. She carefully skirted the gap, her movements practiced and automatic. This was her daily obstacle course, a familiar dance with decay. Her own apartment, 4B, was at the end of the hall. It was just as dilapidated as the rest, but it was hers. The window in the living room was cracked, a spiderweb of fractures that distorted the view of the city's skyline. The faucet in the kitchen sink dripped a slow, rhythmic cadence into a stained porcelain basin. The electricity was a fickle thing, provided by a jerry-rigged connection to the city grid that flickered and died with the slightest provocation. She lit a few candles, their warm, dancing light pushing back against the deep shadows that pooled in the corners of the room. This was home. It was broken, but it was whole to her. That first night after the newest notice, a storm rolled in from the west. Wind howled through broken panes in empty apartments, creating a low, mournful symphony that was the building's nightly lullaby. Rain found its way through the compromised roof, creating a steady plink, plink, plink into a strategically placed bucket in her hallway. She fell asleep to these sounds, the familiar complaints of her aging home. It was a noise that meant she was not entirely alone. She was jolted awake not by the storm, but by a different sound. A sharp, precise tap, tap, tap. It wasn't the random dripping of water. It was the sound of a hammer. Distant, but unmistakably coming from inside the building. Her blood ran cold. No one else was here. It had to be looters, or worse, the demolition crew starting early. She grabbed a heavy flashlight, her heart hammering against her ribs, and crept out into the hallway. The sound seemed to be coming from the stairwell. She moved silently, her bare feet cold on the gritty floor. The hallway was empty. The stairwell was dark and silent. The hammering had stopped as suddenly as it had begun. Shining her flashlight down the stairs, she saw nothing but the same old decay. She was about to dismiss it as a trick of the wind or a dream when the beam of her light caught something on the landing below. The missing section of the banister. It was no longer missing. A new, freshly sanded piece of wood was fitted perfectly into the gap, looking stark and new against the old, varnished wood around it. It was impossible. She stood there for a full minute, staring, her mind refusing to process what her eyes were seeing. The building was fixing itself. The next morning, in the cold light of day, the new banister was still there. It wasn't a dream. She ran her fingers over the smooth, unfinished wood. It felt real. It felt solid. A strange, illogical hope bloomed in her chest. Maybe the building didn't want to be demolished either. Maybe it was fighting back. She spent the day in a state of heightened awareness, examining her home with a new intensity. She found other small changes. A crack in the hallway wall, which had been there for years, was now filled with a fresh, grey compound. A loose floorboard near her door was now firmly nailed down. That evening, she noticed the mirror in her bathroom. It was an old, heavy thing with a tarnished silver frame, and it had a long, diagonal crack running from the top left corner to the bottom right. She had looked into her fractured reflection every day for a decade. But tonight, The glass was seamless. Perfect. Unblemished. She stared at her whole, unbroken reflection, a face she barely recognized without the scar of the crack running through it. The building wasn't just making repairs. It was erasing the evidence of its own decay. It was healing itself. And she was the only witness. A slow, creeping dread began to weave itself through the initial threads of hope. How? And more importantly, with what? The self-repair of the Ravenswood apartments became a silent, nightly ritual. Maya became an archaeologist of the morning, cataloguing the changes she discovered each sunrise. A patched hole in the ceiling where water had once poured through. A window on the second floor, previously boarded up, now held a pristine, clean pane of glass. The changes were always small, always precise, and always utilized materials that seemed to blend seamlessly with the old, as if the building was regenerating its own skin. She started leaving small, deliberate wounds to test it. She chipped a piece of plaster from a wall. The next day, it was smooth. She deliberately loosened a hinge on a cupboard. By evening, it swung perfectly on its screws. This bizarre phenomenon should have terrified her, sent her running from the building for good. But it had the opposite effect. For the first time in her life, she felt a sense of purpose, of being chosen. The building was communicating with her in the only way it could, through the silent language of restoration. It needed her there. She was its caretaker, its witness. The eviction notices, piling up on her kitchen table, felt increasingly irrelevant. They were battling a force they couldn't possibly understand. She was safe here. Protected. Her investigation led her to the basement, a place she had always avoided. It was the heart of the building's decay, a low-ceilinged labyrinth of crumbling brick pillars, ancient, rusted boilers, and puddles of stagnant water. The air was cold and heavy, smelling of wet earth and iron. She used her flashlight to cut through the oppressive gloom, her beam illuminating decades of forgotten junk and the skeletal remains of the building's infrastructure. It was here she found the first real clue to the building's mysterious renovation. In a far corner, behind a massive, silent furnace, she found a pile of materials. But they weren't lumber, drywall, or plaster. They were things. A twisted bicycle frame, rusted and skeletal. A shattered television screen. A pile of water-stained books, their pages fused together into a solid block. And nestled among this urban detritus were more organic items, a collection of bones that looked suspiciously like those of a large dog, several bird nests constructed from shredded plastic and wire, and a thick, matted clump of hair. It was a hoarder's nest, but one curated by a completely alien sensibility. This was the building's source of raw materials. It wasn't magic. It was a scavenger. The realization was a cold splash of water. The building wasn't regenerating, it was repurposing. It was taking the forgotten, the broken, and the dead from within its own body and using them to patch itself up. The new banister wasn't new wood, it was the digested and reformed essence of that bicycle frame. The seamless mirror was the polished, repurposed glass of the shattered television. The thought made her nauseous. She backed away from the pile, her earlier sense of wonder curdling into something closer to revulsion. What had the crack in her bathroom mirror been filled with? That night, the sounds of construction were louder, more purposeful. It wasn't just a single hammer tap anymore. It was the screech of a saw, the dry rustle of something being dragged across the floor below, the wet, squelching sound of mortar being mixed. The building was working faster, more urgently. The 30-day demolition deadline was a ticking clock for it, too. She lay in her bed, covers pulled up to her chin, listening to her home rebuild itself in the dark. It was no longer a comforting sound. It was the sound of a beast preparing for a fight. The next change was not a repair. It was an addition. She woke to find that the hallway outside her apartment was shorter. The wall at the far end, which had once led to a dead-end corridor and the staircase to the 5th floor, had been moved forward by a good 10 feet. The new wall was made of a mismatched patchwork of materials, sections of drywall, strips of wood, even what looked like compressed layers of old newspaper and fabric, all sealed under a layer of fresh, white paint. The building wasn't just fixing itself, it was reconfiguring its own geometry. It was growing inwards, consolidating, becoming denser. A few days later, The most personal violation occurred. A locket, the last gift from her mother before she passed, had gone missing from her bedside table. She tore the apartment apart looking for it, a panic rising in her throat that had nothing to do with the supernatural. It was a simple silver locket, containing a tiny, faded photograph. It was her most treasured possession. It was nowhere to be found. She stood in the center of her living room, a cold certainty settling over her. The building had taken it. It had seen something it needed, something shiny and metallic, and it had absorbed it into its growing body. Her home was no longer just her protector, it was a thief. It was consuming the very memories it was supposed to be sheltering. The final straw came a week later. She was woken from a deep sleep by a sound she had come to dread and anticipate, the frantic, energetic sound of hammering, much closer than ever before. It was right outside her bedroom door. Her heart leaped into her throat. She scrambled out of bed, her flashlight shaking in her hand. She yanked the door open and shone the beam down the hallway. And there it was. A new wall. It had been erected just 5 feet from her doorway, completely sealing off the rest of the apartment and the path to the outside world. The paint was still wet, glistening in the light. And the smell, it was coppery, metallic, and sickly sweet. It was the unmistakable, stomach-churning scent of fresh blood. Maya stood frozen, her flashlight beam trembling on the glistening, crimson wall. The smell filled her nostrils, thick and nauseating, a butcher shop stench that had no place in the sterile decay of her home. This was no longer repurposed junk. This was something organic. This was life, or what was left of it, being used as mortar and paint. Her mind recoiled, flashing to the pile in the basement, the dog bones, the matted fur. Where had this blood come from? A rat? A stray cat that had wandered in? The thought was horrifying, but a worse one slithered in behind it. What if the building's hunger had escalated? What if it had finally started to lure things in? She took a stumbling step back, her shoulder hitting the doorframe. The hammering had stopped. The silence that followed was absolute and heavy, broken only by the frantic thudding of her own heart. The building was done with its work for the night. It had drawn a new line, closer to her. It was shrinking her world, boxing her in. She spent the rest of the night huddled on her bed, staring at the closed bedroom door, expecting at any moment to hear the wet slap of a new wall being built right against it, sealing her in forever. The flashlight was her only comfort, its beam a tiny island of reality in the overwhelming dark. She couldn't stay here. The hope she had felt was gone, completely erased by the visceral horror of that blood-soaked wall. The building wasn't her protector, it was a spider, and she was the fly slowly being wrapped in its web. When the first grey light of dawn finally filtered through her cracked window, she made a decision. She had to get out. Today. Now. She packed a small bag with frantic, clumsy movements, a few pieces of clothing, her remaining food, the bundle of eviction notices as some bizarre proof of her ordeal. She would go to the city officials, to the police. She would tell them everything. They would think she was insane, of course, but maybe the sheer conviction of her terror would be enough to make them see. She slung the bag over her shoulder and took a deep breath, steeling herself. She had to pass the wall to get to the stairwell. She opened her bedroom door. The hallway was short and ended abruptly at the new construction. The paint was dry now, a dull, matte brownish red. It looked less like paint and more like a massive, dried scab. The coppery smell still hung in the air. She hurried past it, refusing to look too closely, her skin crawling. She descended the stairs, her footsteps echoing in the now familiar silence. But when she reached the ground floor, her path was blocked. The lobby doors, the main entrance and exit to the Ravenswood, were gone. In their place was another new wall, this one made of a chaotic jumble of materials, splintered pieces of furniture, chunks of brick, and twisted metal rebar, all fused together under the same dreadful, dried blood sealant. A quiet whimper escaped her lips. She was trapped. The building wasn't just keeping her in, it was severing its connection to the outside world. It was making itself a fortress, with her as its treasure. Panic clawed at her throat. She ran to the back of the lobby, to the fire exit. It was the same. Sealed shut behind a solid, impassable barrier. Desperate, She searched for another way out. A window. A ventilation shaft. Anything. But every potential escape on the ground floor had been meticulously bricked up or filled in with the building's grotesque amalgam of materials. It had been working all night, not just on her floor, but on every possible exit. She was sealed in a tomb that was actively rebuilding itself around her. Exhausted and defeated, she slid down the wall in the dark lobby, the bag dropping from her numb fingers. There was no way out. The demolition was weeks away. No one would come looking for her. She was utterly alone with the thing that was once her home. Hours passed. The panic subsided, replaced by a cold, numb resignation. She had to go back to her apartment. It was the only space she knew, the only place that still felt somewhat like hers, even if that feeling was now a cruel illusion. The climb back up the stairs felt like a march to the gallows. As she passed the third-floor landing, she noticed another change. A door to one of the abandoned apartments, which had always been swelled shut, was now slightly ajar. From within, she heard a faint, rhythmic sound. A soft, wet, squelching noise, like a heart beating in mud. She didn't investigate. She didn't want to know. She quickened her pace, not stopping until she was back inside 4B, slamming the door shut and leaning against it, as if she could physically hold the madness at bay. That night, the sounds began again. But they were different. They were closer, more intimate. The hammering wasn't in the distant stairwell anymore, it was in the hallway, right outside her apartment door. The sawing was coming from the walls of her own living room. She could feel a faint vibration through the floorboards. She curled into a ball on her mattress, pulling the blanket over her head, trying to block it out. But she couldn't block out the smell. The cloying, metallic scent was seeping under her door, filling her apartment. It was the smell of the building's metabolism, the scent of its growth. And it was hungry. She was its final tenant, and it would not let her go. It was making sure of that, room by room, wall by wall, until there was nowhere left for her to run. The days blurred into a single, continuous nightmare. Maya became a ghost in her own home, a prisoner in a shrinking cage. The building's transformations were no longer subtle or limited to the night. She would watch, mesmerized and horrified, as a hairline crack in her ceiling would slowly zip itself shut over the course of an hour, the plaster moving like living skin knitting itself back together. The drip from her kitchen faucet stopped, not because the pipe was fixed, but because the tap itself sealed over, the metal smoothing into a solid, useless lump. The building was systematically removing its own flaws, and in doing so, it was removing the very things that made it a functional living space. It was becoming a perfect, sealed, and lifeless artifact. Her food and water were running low. She had a few bottles of water left and some canned goods, but the can opener had vanished 2 days ago, absorbed into the building's ever-growing mass. She tried to pry a can open with a knife, but her hands were too weak from stress and hunger. The hunger was a constant, gnawing presence in her gut, a dull echo of the building's own vast, consuming hunger. She felt a bizarre kinship with it in her starvation, a thought that terrified her more than the hunger itself. Was this how it started? A slow merging of need until she and the building were one entity? Driven by thirst, she ventured back down to the basement. Perhaps the old, rusted pipes down there still had some stagnant water she could risk drinking. The journey through the building was like navigating a stranger's body. The hallways had shifted, becoming narrower and more winding. Doorways she remembered were now sealed, and new, short corridors had appeared, leading to dead ends or to rooms that should not, by the laws of physics, exist. She felt the building watching her, its consciousness a palpable pressure in the air. It was herding her. It knew she was thirsty. She finally reached the basement, but it was not the place she remembered. The pile of junk was gone. In its place, in the center of the large, open space, was a structure. It was a pillar, reaching from the concrete floor to the low ceiling, but it was not made of brick or metal. It was a grotesque column of fused objects. She could see the twisted bicycle frame from before, now seamlessly integrated with the shattered television, the water-stained books, the dog bones, and countless other unidentifiable bits of debris. All of it was held together by the now familiar dark, resin-like substance that smelled of blood and earth. This was the building's core. Its heart. And it was pulsing. A slow, rhythmic, deep thrum that vibrated through the soles of her feet. As she watched, horrified and transfixed, she saw something glint near the base of the pillar. It was a flash of silver. She crept closer, her thirst forgotten. There, embedded in the grotesque amalgamation, was her mother's locket. It was half submerged in the dark resin, the silver tarnishing rapidly as she watched, as if the building was digesting it. A raw, guttural cry tore from her throat. She lunged forward, scratching at the hard, unyielding surface, trying to dig the locket out. But it was futile. Her fingernails broke and bled against the solid mass. The locket was gone. Truly gone. It was now a part of the building, a piece of her history consumed to fuel its renewal. A new sound started then, a low, grinding rumble that seemed to come from the pillar itself. The thrumming intensified. From the walls of the basement, thin, tendril-like strands of the dark resin began to seep out, slowly at first, then with more purpose. They crept across the floor towards her, not like liquid, but like the roots of a fast-growing plant. The building wasn't just watching her anymore. It was reaching for her. She turned and ran, scrambling back up the stairs, not caring about the shifting layout, driven purely by primal fear. She didn't stop until she was back in her apartment, slamming the door and pushing a heavy chair against it. That night, there was no hammering. No sawing. Only a deep, pervasive silence that felt more threatening than any noise. She sat on her mattress, her back against the wall, watching the door. Hours passed. Then, just as the first hint of dawn touched the sky, she saw it. A thin, black line began to form at the bottom of her apartment door. It wasn't shadow. It was the resin. It was oozing under the door, a slow, deliberate tide. It moved with a strange, sentient viscosity, pooling on the floor and then beginning to creep up the walls. It was sealing her in. Not with a new wall, but by absorbing the room itself, and her along with it. She scrambled onto her bed, pulling her knees to her chest, watching the dark tide rise. This was the final restoration. The building was claiming its permanent tenant. There was no more fear, only a vast, empty acceptance as the first tendril of cold, wet darkness touched the leg of her bed. The tendril of resin was cold. A shocking, deep chill that seeped through the fabric of her pants and into her skin, not like ice, but like the absolute zero of a void. Maya jerked her leg away, scrambling backward on the mattress until her back hit the wall. There was nowhere else to go. The black, tar-like substance continued its inexorable flow under the door, no longer a trickle but a steady, thick stream. It pooled on the floor, deepening quickly, and began climbing the walls with the slow, sure motion of rising floodwater. It moved with a purpose that was utterly alien, a silent, patient hunger that filled the room with a pressure that made her ears pop. She watched, paralyzed, as the substance coated the floorboards, swallowing her discarded bag, her few remaining cans of food, a fallen book. The items didn't float or sink, they were simply absorbed, their outlines blurring and then vanishing into the uniform, glistening blackness. The room was being erased. The building was digesting its contents. And she was the main course. A high, thin sound of pure panic escaped her lips. She couldn't just sit here and let it consume her. She launched herself off the bed, her bare feet landing with a splash in the shallow, cold pool. It was thick, like wading through crude oil. She sloshed towards the window, the last connection to the outside world. The glass was still cracked, a testament to the one thing the building had not yet repaired, perhaps because it was a deliberate feature, a way to let in the air and light it somehow knew she needed to survive until now. She grabbed the heavy flashlight from where it lay on the sill and swung it with all her might at the glass. The crack spread, but the window, reinforced by some unseen will, held. She hit it again, and again, sobbing with the effort, her screams echoing in the small, dying space. A large shard finally broke loose and clattered to the floor outside, leaving a jagged hole. Cold, fresh air rushed in, a painful reminder of the world she was about to lose. Hope, desperate and foolish, flared for a single second. But as she moved to climb out, to try and somehow scale the 4-story sheer wall, the resin at her feet reacted. It thickened around her ankles, climbing her legs like fast-setting cement. It wasn't trying to pull her down, it was anchoring her, fusing her to the spot. She struggled, screaming, pulling with all her might, but she was held fast. The substance was now up to her knees, solid and unyielding. The cold was intensifying, a deep, cellular numbness that was creeping up her body. She was becoming a part of the floor. From the walls, more tendrils emerged, not just seeping now, but actively reaching for her. They slid over the bed, absorbing it into the mass, and snaked toward her torso. One touched her arm, and she felt a sudden, profound absence. Not pain, but a void where the sensation of her own skin should be. It was deleting her, piece by piece. Her struggles grew weaker as the numbness spread to her hips, her stomach. She looked down at her body, half submerged in the glistening, living darkness. This was how it ended. Not with a bang, but with a silent, seamless integration. Her last sight was of the jagged hole in the window, a frame of grey, morning sky, before a tendril gently, almost lovingly, covered her face, and the world went black, and cold, and silent. Silence. Not the empty silence of an abandoned place, but a deep, full, and complete silence. The Ravenswood apartment stood as it always had, a crumbling monolith against the city skyline, but the wind no longer whistled through its broken windows. There were no creaks, no groans, no sounds of dripping water. It was perfectly, utterly still. On the scheduled date, the demolition crew arrived. They noted, with some confusion, that the main lobby doors seemed to be bricked over from the inside, an odd but not insurmountable problem. They used a wrecking ball on the ground floor wall, creating a new entrance. The foreman, a burly man named Ed, was the first to step inside. He expected dust, decay, the smell of rot. Instead, the air was clean and still. Too still. His crew followed him into the lobby, their boots echoing on the floor. But the floor was wrong. It was smooth and seamless, a dark, polished surface that looked like stone but felt slightly soft underfoot. The walls were the same, a uniform, dark grey, devoid of any plaster, wallpaper, or even electrical outlets. It was as if the entire interior had been cast from a single, enormous piece of material. Spooky, one of the younger workers muttered, his voice swallowed by the unnerving acoustics of the space. There were no stairs. Where the staircase should have been, the smooth, dark wall continued upwards without a break. Ed radioed the excavator operator. "We're going to have to take it down from the outside. Places, weird inside." As the heavy machinery roared to life outside, Ed shone his flashlight down the only hallway available. It was short and ended in another of the smooth, dark walls. But something was different about this one. As his beam played over it, he saw a shape. A faint, human-shaped outline embedded just beneath the surface of the material. It was the silhouette of a young woman, her arms slightly raised, her head tilted. It was incredibly detailed, like a fossil in amber. "Hey, you guys see this?" he called out, his voice uneasy. The other workers gathered around. As they stared, another man pointed his light at a different section of the wall. There was another shape, smaller, canine. A dog. And further down, the vague, distorted outline of what looked like a bird. The building was a museum of everything it had ever consumed. A tomb of trophies. A sudden, deep thrum vibrated through the floor, a single, powerful pulse that they felt in their bones. It was the sound of a massive, contented heartbeat. The building was alive, and it was sated. They evacuated quickly, a superstitious dread overcoming their professional skepticism. The wrecking ball swung, striking the upper floors. But the Ravenswood did not crumble like a normal building. The brick facade shattered, but beneath it was the same smooth, dark, resilient material. It resisted. It held. The demolition became a battle, a noisy, violent assault against a silent, immovable foe. It took them weeks, not days, to finally reduce the structure to rubble. But even in the rubble, the strange, dark material remained in large, indestructible chunks. They hauled it away to a landfill, a forgotten puzzle. Years passed. A new, gleaming glass and steel condominium complex was built on the site. It was bright, modern, and efficient. But the people who moved in never stayed long. They complained of the silence in their apartments, a silence so deep it felt like a physical presence. They spoke of cold spots that no heater could warm. And sometimes, in the dead of night, residents on the 4th floor would report a strange, faint smell that would come and go, a coppery, metallic scent, like old blood, followed by the fleeting, ghostly sensation of something cold and viscous touching their skin in the dark. The Ravenswood was gone, but its final, perfect tenant had left an indelible mark on the land, a permanent echo of its hunger, waiting patiently in the foundations of the new world for the next restoration to begin.